other hand, before the mobility grants, we did not have very many people going from Norway and abroad. It was very few people. Or 17 or something, but yeah.
Yeah.
So,
but as you perhaps.
Okay.
Det kan jo være at det noen her som må gå klokken ett.
Ja.
Jeg synes at vi bør prioritere de som kommer.
Ja. Så da funker det.
Okay. Sorry about that. Mark, the floor is yours.
Yeah, okay. All right, so I'm going to move away a little bit from talking about the bureaucracy of the Marie Curie and actually tell you like my story. So I will give an overview of my own career and my research at the point that I applied for the Marie Curie. Then I'll explain how I structured my proposal. I'll show you what the reviewers said about my proposal and also give you some of my own advice. Now, I will talk a little bit about my research because last time I gave this, it was to a group of biologists. I know that not everyone is in that field, so it will be nice and broad, hopefully, and understandable for everyone. And of course, I'm happy to answer some questions about that if anyone wants to ask me them later. So, maybe I should start with introducing myself. So I'm from the UK, I'm from the southeast of the UK, and I did my PhD in Northern Ireland, actually, on evolutionary biology. And then I moved from Northern Ireland to Japan and did a postdoc there. I also did a postdoc in Sweden and went back to Japan and did another postdoc. So I moved around a lot. And then in 2015, at the end of 2015, I got a job as a researcher on a Norwegian Research Council position at CS in Oslo. And when I arrived in Oslo, this is basically when I applied for the Marie Curie. But I want to give a picture of how I sort of came about to actually writing that application. So the first point from this slide is that one thing I had when I applied is a lot of mobility. So one thing that people apply to the Marie Curie for is perhaps to move countries and show that they've got an international background, but I didn't need that part. So basically my research is about speciation. I'm really interested in how species evolve, and I have been interested in that since I was very, very young. And this is actually something that obviously Charles Darwin addressed in his Origin of Species, and it's this, he famously called it this mystery of mysteries, and he's often criticised for not having actually answered how species evolved, but I think that's a bit unfair. So my research has really been driven towards using Darwin's ideas, particularly selection and adaptation, to understand how species evolve. And what we know about species is that they're quite hard to define. So if you've got any knowledge of this at all, most of the 20th century was spent with these really quite vicious debates about how to define a species, and once we define them, how do they actually come about? So what my work is really focused on is, in the last decade or so, there's been a kind of revolution in evolutionary biology, and the use of genomics has really become very popular. So I work on speciation from a kind of genomic level, and so very basically what I'm really interested in is how you can go from divergence at just one gene in a genome to eventually building up to this complete reproductive isolation between two populations, and eventually they become these divergent evolutionary entities. And so this is my background and what most of my research since my PhD has been on. And that has involved a lot of work on this fish species, and you don't really need to understand this too much other than that there are many species pairs of this fish across the world, and I've worked on lots of them, and they kind of build up this picture of increased divergence until you get the only true species at the end of this continuum of divergence. And so prior to coming to Norway, my research was very much focused on this species. And so what I'm trying to get across is that I had expertise in a very specific area and also a specific technique, and I thought I could apply it to a newer question. So in Oslo, I came to work on something completely different to fish, and now I work on birds. And so my supervisor in Norway had a research council project funded just before I arrived on hybrid speciation. So in Italy, there's this sparrow species, the Italian sparrow, and it's a hybrid between its two parents. And one of these birds is the house sparrow, which is a bird that you'll see all over Europe, and in particular you see it quite heavily in Oslo. So when I got here, there was a very sort of definite research question in this project that I contributed to, and we recently published a series of papers which basically used some genomic data to essentially prove to some extent that this is a hybrid species that's evolved from the joining of two divergent lineages. And again, it doesn't matter if you don't really understand what these analyses are. The point is that I was able to contribute my expertise to this project. And whilst working on this project is when I started to get my own research idea. So very soon after arriving, I started to think a bit about various questions. And one of the questions I was really interested in is how this bird species, the house sparrow, can be so associated with humans, but we don't really know where it came from. And so I was actually really surprised. It was one of the first questions I actually asked my current supervisor. What's his history, and are there any good references? And he told me there aren't any. And so I realised no one had ever addressed this question. And so you have this species which is actually one of the most widely distributed birds on Earth. It occurs all over Europe, and it's been introduced to various other parts of the world as well. And we don't know its origin. And so there's this hypothesis in this very old book from, well, not that old, but it was written the same year I was born, this book from the 80s that suggests that maybe these birds evolved a association with humans during the invention of agriculture in the last 10,000 years. And then when this was introduced, this spread of human technology into Europe, this bird came along with it. So perhaps by investigating their story, we can also learn something about our own recent history and the spread of our own civilization. And so it was with this idea that I thought, right, well, I can write a proposal to suggest research on this. And so that is what led me to apply. And I was in the criteria. I had lived here for less than a year. I had my own interests, and I thought I can use the techniques that I've developed throughout my career to address this question. And so I applied for a Marie Curie. And I think this is now the point where we move away from what I did and I explain a bit more about how I approach this. So one thing you'll discover as soon as you open this guide for applicants is that it is a good document, but it's not exactly a light read. It's very heavy and full of bureaucratic language. But there are some really useful clues in there about how you should structure your proposal. And I think that a lot of them have already been mentioned, actually. So if you read this one paragraph, they define the Marie Curie action as to enhance the creative and innovative potential of experienced researchers wishing to diversify their individual competence in terms of skill acquisition through advanced training, international and intersectoral mobility. So if you take away some of the kind of clunky words, in my opinion, like competence and such, basically what they're telling you is you need to have a good creative idea. You should develop a plan to use your skills as this knowledge transfer word that we've heard a lot about, transfer your own knowledge to your host institute, gain knowledge from them, and if you can, some kind of cross-disciplinary collaboration is also very valuable. But what you really shouldn't lose sight of is this idea that it's to improve your skills and mobility. So what you should do is start with your own ambitions. You should think about what do you want to achieve, and then you should analyse your career to that point and try and think about what you need in your CV to achieve the goals that you have in the future. So that's why I led with this story about my own background, because personally I really want to start my own laboratory. I want my own independent research career, and I want to pursue a very specific question. And so I thought okay, in a few years' time, I'd like to apply for some larger grants that will allow me to establish my own group. What do I need for that? Well, I already have expertise in a specific technique. I already have international mobility. So I looked at my CV and thought, right, well, I don't have very much experience in communication because I've just never really had the opportunity to do any outreach or anything like that. And I also don't have much experience with things like supervision because of unfortunately, I never had the chance to say supervise a master's or PhD student. So those were two things that I really targeted in my proposal. So the first piece of advice I would give you is to have a very nice summary figure that basically explains what your proposal will do and put it close to the start of the proposal as you possibly can. Because I guess if someone is looking at like 20 of these things at once, then you want something that kind of is an easy identifier for your project, and it also shows that you've put some thought into it. So I made this figure here, and it's on page 1 of my proposal. And actually, you've just seen the slide you saw a couple of slides ago is an updated version of this, actually. And so in that, it's fairly schematic, but it basically has the 3 objectives of my project laid out, and it did them in a graphical way. Right, so anyone reading this figure can see the 3 main aims. And then the text, obviously this isn't an excuse to write about what you're going to do, not write about what you're going to do, but it's just a very simple summary. And it's also worth using things like tables to do exactly the same thing. So for example, in the dissemination plan, you can save a lot of space with a very clear table that lays out exactly what you intend. And the other thing about this is it's a good way to kind of structure your thinking, because what you want is a logical flow. You want a project that has clear, defined objectives that you can achieve in a sort of series of steps. And one other tip I can give you is to think about future impacts of your work. So in my proposal, so as you've already seen several times now, it's about the association of this bird species with humans, and it's this phenomena that's not very well studied in actually any species. So domestication, for example, has had a lot of attention, but not this kind of more sedentary lifestyle. And so I put in this kind of hint that if you fund me, then in the future I can work on all these other species and actually expand this into a much bigger framework. So one thing I stressed a lot, and it tied into my ambition to eventually have my own research group, is that, well, this is just one part of the puzzle. There's actually lots more. And so in these bird species, it turns out that there's actually three other instances of exactly the same phenomena. So I didn't spend too much time on this, but it is really worth saying, you know, this is the first step in a very long research program where we can ask more and more interesting questions, and we need this funding to do it. And so the other big part of my proposal was to think quite hard about secondments. So I thought long and hard about this, and I decided to put 2 secondments into my project. One to actually help with the implementation of the project itself. So one thing I had no experience in whatsoever is behavioural ecology and bird behaviour, and actually working with birds at all. And so I wrote a secondment to go and visit a friend of mine, Matteo, in Italy, and work with him for a month or training. And so I built this into the proposal as kind of being essential for the project itself to run smoothly. And maybe I can also learn from his sense of style, perhaps. And so the next secondment I had was a non-academic one. So I also thought, as I mentioned earlier, that I didn't have a great deal of experience in science communication and outreach. And I thought, well, this is actually something I believe very strongly in. I mean, I've benefited myself from science outreach and popular science in the past. So I thought, well, how can I make something that doesn't just... I didn't just want to write, I'm going to tweet and blog, although I did write those things. But I didn't just want to say, you know, put together something half-baked. I actually thought, well, this is something I could really do properly. So I actually contacted a charity in the UK who deal with communicating science to the public, particularly children, and I agreed with them to have a 1-month secondment with them to create a lecture on my proposal and on my subject, because I think that it's something that the public could be interested in. And actually then, as part of the dissemination package, my project will culminate in 2 public lectures, one in the UK and one hopefully in Norway. And so this is something that this is the way I thought I could achieve it, with actually building in some training. Now, of course, I've mentioned my secondments in the context of my own proposal, but I think what I meant to say a few slides back is that if your ambition is something completely different, like to work in industry or something, you can also structure your proposal and your secondments to show that you want to achieve this goal. And I really didn't put them in just for fun. Like, I actually really want to do this. So, and another essential component is the work plan, and you really should not overlook this, because as has been mentioned, the science is just one aspect, and what you really need is to show that you've thought this through. So a lot of people, I think it's mandatory actually to have a Gantt chart. Yeah, though you can, so they don't have to be particularly fancy. But what you should do is show that you've really thought this through. So my project is split into 5 work packages, and then each one has an implementation plan. And I also have these milestones, and those milestones are linked to my dissemination plan. And so in my proposal, I basically said, I'm going to do this, and then at this point, this will be a milestone for the project, and this is also matched by a particular dissemination criteria. And those are things like giving a report to the European Union, going to a conference, giving a departmental seminar. I also actually built a workshop into my proposal because of the expertise I had from my previous work. I basically said I will give a workshop in my department, and also the public lectures. And so it's really worth spending a bit of time and thinking this through. And of course, I guess it's not a binding plan, but again, you want to show that you haven't just coloured in a chart in a couple of tables. You've really thought about how you will actually implement the project. So, and this is the slide I'm always sort of most embarrassed to show, because I now have to show you what they said about it. But I think it's quite informative, actually, because it does kind of reinforce some of the goals. So for the science part, they said it was interesting and innovative, and that it had implications for human prehistory and conservation. They said that the proposal showed a substantial transfer of knowledge from the researcher to the host. So that's, again, showing that you can give something to the host institute is really valuable. And they also liked that I presented a clear vision of where I and the field that I work in should go. So again, I sold the proposal as the start of a larger research program to address a question that hasn't really been addressed in huge detail in the field. And they liked other things as well. So they also said that the science made simple secondment was a good way to improve communication skills. So again, it was that they thought it was well thought out. They said the work plan itself was useful, realistic, and had clear deliverables and milestones. And they also, and I think this is a crucial point actually, said that there's a realistic appraisal of risks accompanied by good contingency plans. And again, you should really, I think it's very, very wise to actually show that you thought about what will happen if the project doesn't go to plan, which, I mean, if you've done any science ever, is almost always the case. So, for example, in mine, I laid out a lot of groundwork to explain that actually a lot of the field work and the sample collection had already been done prior to the project beginning, and so that itself wasn't a risk. And I also explained that each work package could be split into different publications if the whole the whole project didn't work quite as how we planned. And I really think it's worth spending some time on that, because again, they like it quite a lot. So some tips before you write. I probably covered most of them, but I'll just go over them again. Again, I really think it's important to start with your goal. Think about what your career trajectory is and your research, and think about how you can build a proposal that will really enhance your CV, essentially. And so it's a good thing to actually start with analysing your CV and identifying what you need to improve. So in my case, it was things like communication, supervision, and also I wanted to show that I could run an independent project. And actually, you can actually do a CV analysis. I actually put it in the proposal. I put it at the start of my CV. It was just a paragraph saying that I had a lot of mobility, but that I didn't have supervisionary skills and that kind of thing. You should read 1 or 2 successful proposals. Don't read too many. I think looking at too many can be very confusing. But find a good one and use it as inspiration. And one really crucial tip is to work on a decent elevator pitch and make it into an abstract. So I actually went to a workshop for writing proposals, and we were given a task of writing an elevator pitch. The person next to me started their elevator pitch with a mathematical formula, which I would say is probably not the best way to begin a open summary to a non-specialist. I certainly didn't understand it. But I think of course you shouldn't overdo this, but thinking about how you could explain your research in a very clear and open way is really valuable. And remember that the abstract is the first thing that they'll read, and you want to leave a good impression there. And it also helps you structure your proposal, because as you say, it should be understandable by a non-specialist in your field. So again, the tips I've given are: make a summary figure and feature it early, because it's useful to structure your own thinking, and it also makes the proposal stand out. You should spend time making a realistic work plan. This is now my personal opinion, but I think you should write in the first person, because it shows that, first of all, you wrote it, and it just feels a bit more personal, rather than referring to yourself in the third person, which I feel feels a bit stuffy when you're reading a proposal. You really shouldn't overlook the small things. Things like public engagement, social media, training other people and yourself, those are actually important. And again, you don't necessarily have to spend a very long time on them, but just think about how you can address these things and pay attention to them in the proposal. And as I mentioned before, you can actually put your CV analysis in the proposal if you wish, in the second part. So that's actually me. So good luck, and I'll take some questions if you have some.
Thank you, Mark. It's great. You are two also going to get a cup.
Thank you very much.
It's wrapped up, and our bank.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know that, from our point of view, it's a disaster the way things worked out, but not the presentations by Mark and by Alicia. And I really think they brought you a lot of good ideas, tips and hints about what to do, and perhaps also what not to do. Those of you who need to run, please feel free. Bring along some T-shirts or caps or whatever from the Maria Skłodowska Curie Actions. Should we allow for some questions for those of you who are interested? Do any of you have questions to Mark, or perhaps Alicia, or Berit and myself? Or are you? I know it's Friday, and with the way this meeting went technically, we're pretty done. But any questions? Everything crystal clear? Probably not. No, but yes.
Yeah, for a lot of people, taking a postdoc is about getting enough publications so you can qualify for a tenure track later. How much if you don't have that kind of experience, if you haven't published so much during your PhD, how much should you focus on writing the scientific articles and publishing?
Well, I mean, if your intention is to stay within the academic world, of course you should have a focus on that. I mean, like it or not, this is one of the most important ways you are measured on later on. And in order to win new grants, you do need to publicize. In order to win an ERC starting grant, you have to show that you also is able to publish without the cooperation of your supervisor. In order,
Your PhD supervisor, or
your PhD supervisor, yes, of course, your PhD supervisor.
yeah.
So of course, this is something which is quite central.
Yeah, that's why I asked.
Yes. So
There's all these other questions about outreach and communication and all these other kinds of things you should address as well.
Yes.
And that could take away the focus from actually writing and doing the scientific stuff. I feel.
Yes, but still.
How to balance those.
Yeah, well, I mean, you need to try to balance it, because even though this is not something that you do perhaps out of pure pleasure, still this is something that the European Commission wants you to do, and that is why they fund you. So you need to set aside a certain amount of time also for these tasks. Yeah. And it's also important in the long run. I mean, look at the role of science in society. Yeah. We need to prove to the general public and the policymakers that what you as an individual is doing on the scientific arena really pays off in some kind. So I know it might feel like a drag, but still it has to be done.
Yeah, but also on the other hand, I think a lot of those things will also be useful if you continue in the academic world and get a professorship. Because you will also need to sort of, give the elevator pitch and to write proposals and to do all those other things that is sort of called complementary skills, and which you have to learn sometime. So this is more like that, making people aware of that. You have to learn those things and try to build it into sort of your education or your training plan in a way.
I didn't mean to undersell publications. Like in my proposal, they're actually really quite central and built in. But like one thing you could do, for example, is say, I have no publications independent from my PhD supervisor. This will allow me to do it. And I actually mentioned in my proposal that I have lots of publications in small level journals, no big ones, and this project will allow me to achieve high profile publications. So you can and should mention it, like I definitely did. So, yeah. And if you don't have a huge number already, I mean, you don't need a massive number, as I think the chart with the years after PhD showed, but some obviously help. So.
I mean, if you look at the requirements for applying for an ERC starting grant, 2 to 7 years after your PhD, you need to have at least one publication independent of your PhD supervisor, and of course this gradually grows.
But you explicitly have to say that in your proposal. I mean, that's why you're already applying, so you already know that.
You mean to the ERC or to the individual fellowships?
To Marie Curie, individual fellowship.
Well, I mean,
it's.
I think you should say it. Yeah, because even though the evaluators are very competent, you need to show them that you also are competent and that you know what is demanded of you in your line of career. So spell it out instead of just assuming that the rest of the world or the evaluators know what you are thinking. So spell it out. It's about communication, really. Yeah. That's a good question. Yes. I think you can just speak loudly.
I was wondering, you mentioned that you got about how you, something that was missing out in your CV was supervision and like teaching is also something that we can lack, and it's difficult to get the job in an academic job in Norway if you don't have teaching. Is that something that can be a part of the application and the work that you will do when you go away, that you can arrange with the host to do some teaching?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think there has been some discussions about it in the past, and so people can't be concerned that they are telling you to do too much teaching because you should concentrate on your project. But I think if you, in your proposal, you put it in that, okay, I don't have very much experience teaching, that will be useful for me. It's part of my training to do teaching. And that's a good thing, I think, if you can agree with the host that you will be allowed to teach a small course or do some lab training or whatever.
I have 2 years experience of teaching. It is weakness to present on my proposal so that there's no need to retrain in the host institution. I mean, the other station with the girls, she lacks some experience of teaching. If I have, should I mention it in my proposal?
Well, you have to mention it in your CV. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
You can teach a new teaching methodology to your host.
Yeah. You can bring it as an asset to your host. Yeah. That's true. Okay. Thank you again, Mark. Thank you, Alicia. We're really sorry about the technical system and the delay. But feel free to contact Berit and myself if you have questions, if you need someone to, play ball with, to discuss ideas, to see if you interpret what the EU is saying in the Guide for Applicants in the correct way, or are there several ways of interpreting, like a question about teaching? I mean, every situation, every fellow has a unique situation, and those questions can occur, and we meet a lot of fellows, both successful and unsuccessful, and we have some experience in advising you. And also use the EU advisors at your institutions. Put them in the loop, because they are very valuable for us and for you. So with that, I think I just thank you for showing up, and best of luck.